This one's on? Yeah, this one's on.
Hello, everybody. So, I was involved early on in the very start of Amiga. Jay Miner is very well known as the famous architect of the Amiga, and he hired me before he actually started at Amiga. So I was the first engineer there, and I worked on the architecture of the chipset, including the various features you may have heard of, like the blitter and hold and modify and such. So I was very proud to have the opportunity to work on that design. And the biggest thing is that I wasn't sure if the design would be successful, but here all of you are.
Yeah, so I was hired at Commodore in '83 to design systems, and first one I worked on was the +4. Good, +4 fan, and C128, and then I was trying to find justification for my existence there when Commodore had bought Amiga, and nobody wanted 8-bit systems anymore, and so I came in on the 500, and I was sort of poised. So 500 was started by Jeff Porter and George Robbins. George Robbins had been the C900, Z8000 guy working on the high-end systems. So they thought, well, we'll give the 500 to Dave and George can go on and do the 2000, only George didn't want to give up the 500 because it was his baby. So I became the high-end systems guy kind of, at age 23 or whatever. No, 24. And so at Commodore, I just worked on systems, whatever came along, trying to make better Amigas, and I still design systems today. So system, hardware, some software maybe. I can do both, but it's mostly been hardware.
At that days, your environment, your family, your friends, did they understand what you do with these computers in the early days?
Yeah, I usually explain it pretty well. That I make the I design the computer. I put the chips down on the board. I don't design the chips more, except for Buster chips. But yeah, they understood pretty well. They didn't understand that much about it, but then I do have a bunch of nerdy friends too. So some of them kind of get it. My wife still doesn't know what I do. She only knows that I know how to make computers work, including the internet, and if something isn't working, I will fix it.
Yeah, my wife also asks me for help with the computer, but I have to tell her to Google it because I don't understand some of the things in the newer computers. I had the advantage of starting working in Silicon Valley, so of course all my friends were all in a computer company, so we were sort of competing against each other and designing interesting things.
What did I write? There's always a question about those role models. Starting in Silicon Valley is a bit different having a role model, but companies in the US are still very old. They come back to the 20s, 30s of the 20th century. Do you have someone in mind when you start doing your work, like, oh, he had made such an impact with his work? Could I be in this stage someday? Do you have something like a role model for your work?
Well, of course. Like I said, Jay Miner, I started working with him actually not on the Amiga. The original chip that Jay Miner and I did was a second source clock chip for, of all things, the original Macintosh. That was the first project we worked on, and that's how we got introduced. And give me back the question again. And obviously, he's a role model because he's one of the most expert chip designers in Silicon Valley, having done the chips in the Atari 2600 VCS and the chips in the Atari 400, 800, as well as being a founder of several companies in Silicon Valley, like Cinertech, the second source for the 6502 used in the C64. So Jay Miner was definitely one of my major mentors. At several of the companies I worked at before I met Jay, I was was always impressed with engineers who could do both software and hardware. So I learned to always design hardware from the software programmer's perspective, and some of the Amiga programmers tell me that they're glad I did it that way.
Yeah, I guess I got into electronics through my dad, who was an electronics engineer at Bell Laboratories. In fact, I worked 2 summers at Bell Laboratories, and if there had not been a breakup of AT&T, I probably never would have worked at Commodore, because I was likely to go and work there when I graduated college, except they had hiring freeze, so they weren't hiring anybody that year. And I guess at Commodore, it was Bill Hurd was my mentor. Really, the only, other than my dad, the only one I ever had, because he was a self-taught engineer, still is. He taught himself engineering, and got to the point where he was given like the flagship project at Commodore, having worked his way through it. So this guy knew how to do stuff that it's sort of my second level of college, the stuff they don't teach you in school, like, if you want, you're looking for that glitchy signal before they had digital scopes, what do? You turn off the lights in the room so you can see that one little trace on the oscilloscope that you couldn't see. But, where do you learn that? You learn it from Bill Hurd. So, yeah, that was my inspiration in electronics. I was inspired by science fiction growing up too. So, I always wanted to, when I went to college, I majored in electrical engineering, computer science, and psychology, cognitive psychology, because I wanted to build the Terminator.
Of course.
Tell us something about the work at Commodore. You worked there in the early days. Your impressions of the company at the early days there.
Well, I actually never worked at Commodore, because I left Amiga just before the purchase. I worked at the earliest days when it was still called High Toro originally. That's the company that Dave Morse, the founding president of Amiga, founded. I worked for that until they changed the name to Amiga, and when we finished the original chipset, that's about the time that another company, actually 2 companies, were bidding for it, and Dave Morse very carefully kept Atari from acquiring it, and so we ended up being, the Amiga architecture ended up being a Commodore product.
Which is, of course, how I got involved. And so my early days of Commodore weren't the early days of Commodore, because it was, I got in there, actually I got in when they were running the promotion in the US to, you could trade in any kind of computer and get $200 off the C64. So we had when I interviewed, there was this room full of old computers of all random sorts, and I'm like, well, what is this? Oh yeah, they sent them here because they didn't know what to do with them, and people sent them in and got their $200 off. That was in October of 1983. Naturally, after Christmas, Jack dropped the price of the C64 by $200 anyway for everybody. So he had already planned to do that. It was just to run the promotion, and we acquired a number of the Sinclair 1000 or whatever it was called. They called it the Timex Sinclair in the U.S. It makes a perfect doorstop for the doors of Commodore. So those were actually the most prized computers anyone turned in, because it would actually slide under your door just perfectly. So yeah, early days of Commodore, and that was kind of, most of the C6, well, not most, a lot of the C64 people had already left. They hadn't quite figured out what to do as a sequel to the Commodore 64 then. They were doing the Plus 4, which was originally supposed to be a tiny Sinclair-like computer, because Jack Tramiel was afraid of a $99 computer that Commodore didn't make, right? So unfortunately, as the Tramiels were leaving the company, that got turned into this, this extra thing that we didn't really need. So it became the Plus 4. We didn't really have any say on the final form of the system. There is a Commodore 116 that you've probably seen in prototype form that's got a chiclet keyboard and looks a lot like the Timex, only it had 16K of memory, and you could actually do stuff with it. But it was a weird time, because Commodore was like not really, they were a little directionless, a little rudderless before Amiga. The C128 was the 3rd attempt to make a sequel to the C64, first one that worked. At the same time, they were also working on the 3rd attempt to make the Z8000 machine work, the one that George Robbins and Bob Welland were working on. And that also worked. Unfortunately, when Commodore got Amiga, they had kind of blown all their cash, and so you had to choose one or the other, and they weren't going to not make the Amiga after spending millions of dollars to acquire it. And it was the right decision, but I kind of wanted both because the C900 was essentially a home computer version of the Sun 2 workstation with the megapixel display and all the stuff that you wouldn't have for years later on other machines. Yeah, I mean, and then we started, we just kind of smoothly transitioned. Some of us smoothly transitioned into the Amiga years. I had the year. I guess it was the summer of '85. After we had seen the Amiga, after Commodore had purchased it and everything, we were sent one of the black Zorro systems, and nobody could really get near it. And a couple people were given the original green documentation for the Amiga 1000, and you had to sign your name to get it. And so Bill Hurd had one of those. And the very first night he got it, I stayed late and photocopied the whole thing. So I had my own copy. Because I wanted to read out what this thing was. Like, oh, this is an exciting new computer. I should know it. And that's one reason it wasn't very hard for me to jump onto the 500 for a month before I took over the 2000. And I guess that brings us into not so early Commodore.
About the documentation, we thought that was really important to do good documentation on the Amiga so that programmers could really, get into it and access it. And we actually bought one of the very first Apple leases ever sold just to write good Amiga documentation, which of course Dave got to use.
Yes, it was very good documentation, and I would tell you if it wasn't, because I deal with chip companies all the time, and let me tell you about Qualcomm. Some of these companies don't know how to write their documentation. So when you have the good documentation, it makes all the difference in the world to the people trying to work with that tool, whatever that tool is.
Ron, you were one of the designers of Agnes, Denise, and Paula. Can you tell us the history behind the names, if someone doesn't know it?
When we were first starting to expand, the original team was Jay Miner, Joe DeCure, and myself. And then we decided to hire some more people. Jay hired Mark Shue and Mark Chu, who we worked with at Atari on analog design. They're important in getting the circuit design right for the original chipset. And then we needed to hire some more people, so I went back to my network and hired Bob Paraso, who I had worked with before, and also Dave Dean, who worked on, I guess it was the Daphne chip originally. Did they rename that? But anyway, and then someone randomly sent a resume to Joe DeCure. He was a student of oceanography at MIT, and we go, what's this guy? Well, let's bring him out and interview him anyway. And that turned out to be Glenn Keller, who turned out to be an extremely good chip designer, and he did the audio chips. He finished the audio chips and the audio logic for the Amiga original chipset. And then later on, we brought in some consultants, including Dave Needle, and Dave Needle turned out to be such a good designer, he essentially replaced me.
Perfect. Replacing you. So this is all the Amiga. If I listen to stories like this, it always sounds to me that Amiga is a big lucky punch in just the right time. Would you say that this is it's just luck that it fits all together in this time?
In history, it's always hard to tell. It's sort of like, in hindsight, you can think you were brilliant when a lot of times you got lucky. A lot of the decisions Jay and I could not decide on. Should we do it Ron's way or Joe DeCure's way or Jay's way or whatever? And we eventually sort of just voted or flipped a coin, and we weren't sure whether things like hold and modify would be useful at all. But what the programmers tell us, oh, that's one of the most brilliant things, where we weren't even sure it would work.
Okay.
So it was some of it's just being creative, and some of it is some of your creativity turns out to be a really lucky guess.
Dave, we talk about the first days, and we had to talk about the last days. You left Commodore in 1994, short before they went bankrupt. Can you tell us something about the situation at the company in the last month? And what were your feelings about it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I know that we were that last year, '93 to '94. We were they had made some very bad decisions about I think largely about making AA chips. They Pandora chip, AA chip, AGA, whatever you want to call it. We originally called them Pandora because it was opening Pandora's box. The management, the new management team had decided that the AA chips were not that important, and they were trying really hard during most of 1992 to not make AA systems, and then it became clear that nobody wanted another ECS machine. In fact, they made some of you may have heard of the so-called 3200 and 3400, which were basically cost-reduced A3000s they were done in '92 at the request of the new bosses, and they were presented to the Commodore sales divisions because Commodore had this weird structure that there was a central company and engineering reported to the central company, and each marketing and sales company reported there, but they weren't all like one. They were all like, each region had its own, and not a single regional company wanted another version of the A3000. So they had a little bit of a problem. So they scrambled to get the A4000 done the way it was. That was not going to be the original A4000. That was and then they didn't order enough chips because Commodore used to make Commodore's used to making chips, but the Alice chip was the largest NMOS chip they ever made, and Lisa in there was a CMOS chip. Now Commodore had a CMOS process, but it wasn't a very good one. So we were making those at Hewlett-Packard, and this was before you could. Today there's a dozen companies who'd like to make you a chip. A couple of them do it very well, and others are so-so. But back then it was hard to get somebody to make you a chip. They would, but you had to find the right company, and you had to order it way in advance and get on their schedule. And the bosses, people running things, did not allow that to happen. So we also had things like, I know it's become more popular, but when the A600 came out, not so popular. They had canceled the A500. It was sort of an NIH thing, not invented here, in that the new management had made the 600. So you had to cancel the 500 so that people would buy the 600. Only people didn't really want the 600 because those who were still buying 500s wanted to put add-ons in them, and all the add-ons for the 600 were completely different. So anyway, in '93 we had 92 and '93 we had A600s. I guess 92 we had A600s available. Nobody wanted them. No 1200s. They existed, but there just weren't that many of them. So Commodore took a huge loss. So the next year, they're trying to get the CD32 out the door, and and other computers that we built. And they owe everyone so much money, they can't buy parts on credit anymore. So they had to pay cash, which also limited. So in '93, when the CD32 came out, they got maybe a quarter, maybe a fifth of the number of CD32s they probably could have sold, because just of being able to buy parts and all that. And it was just, you could see, you look at it, you look at it from the top perspective, you could kind of see them circling the toilet bowl there with all the bad decisions that were being made at the top. And some of it became an engineering problem because we hadn't spent enough money to do things quickly enough. You probably heard about the AAA chips. That project was started in 1988, and yet in 1993 I got the first system sort of kind of up and running with the first silicon, and a lot of things didn't work, and including the Andrea chip would never shut up, so we couldn't even tell if the other chips worked very well because the Andrea chip was always on the bus. I mean, they were just like, ew, it was first rev silicon, and we had to fib it to get it to talk to either VRAM or DRAM because the memory control had some kind of bug in it, and it was just, it would have been fine. That would have been great to have all those kinds of problems back in maybe 1989 or 1990, and then we would have had the first 64-bit system shipping graphics systems shipping in in '92 or whatever. But they just didn't invest enough in the resources at the company. So that's really that's how you take a badly run company with good engineers and make it an engineering problem.
I beat you to it because after several companies after Amiga, I ended up working at Silicon Graphics on the N64, and so we got the first 64-bit game chip out.
Was that 64-bit graphics?
That was 64-bit graphics and the CPU also.
Yeah, I knew it was a 64-bit chip, CPU, yeah.
From an engineering perspective, are you astonished that those systems all still work? If you work on a thing that is the purpose is, in my opinion, you design something, it turns out to be a product, the product is sold, so you don't think about how that sold product turns old. We are now in 2022. Do you ever had imagined that these systems will live more than 30 years?
I'm a volunteer docent at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, and working there, we have a lot of vintage computers, and I also know friends who've worked for computer companies who, worked with brilliant teams designing stuff that wasn't even popular enough to go into the History Museum. So it's a lot of very brilliant designs end up being forgotten and lost and never used again. So I'm incredibly surprised because after Commodore went bankrupt, I thought, well, that's the end of that. A design that I worked really hard on with a bunch of really smart people that will be long forgotten. And then a few decades later, people call me up and say, would you like to come to our convention on the Amiga? And I'm going, there's still people who are interested in this? Wow!
So it is.
I guess I'm one of the lucky ones, but like I said, I worked with a lot of brilliant engineers, and it takes a combination of that and luck to be one of the ones.
Do you play games on Amiga? And if yes, which were the games you would play still today?
I'm actually not a game player. I'm a hardware designer. I have fun tinkering with interesting circuits.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I like computer games. The problem is they take huge amounts of time to play, especially these days. I mean, on the Commodore, on the Amiga, I did play a bunch of games. On the C128, I played games mostly for testing purposes. At least that's what I was telling my bosses at the time. A big one on the C128 was Wizard of War, because if there was anything at all wrong with the design of the system, Wizard of War wouldn't play, because it did things like fetching sprite data from the ROM cartridge and all kinds of evil stuff. On the Amiga, I played a lot of Marble Madness. I liked Archon. I didn't play. Mindwalker. I made it all the way through Mindwalker, and I played that on every single machine I built, because that was done pre-release, and yet it kept working, and I was like, if Mindwalker doesn't work, I've done something wrong. So I did play that a lot.
Have both of you ever tried to engineer something with like a system that, like we play Lego? You worked in that years. You worked on big plates and painted something like where the lanes should be, or you worked you told me the only thing that was made was on one side, all the connectors have to be on the one side, and then you put the chips on it and shovel it on the right place and hope that it would work, and then you turn out to how it works. Have you ever done it in lately with modern technology? Like we talked about FPGAs, and sort of...
Well, Dave and I both come from the culture where, every little bit counts. We came with computers small enough where every byte of code and every transistor counted. And so I learned from engineers back in those days. I actually learned from Woz, who turned chips around to save holes in the circuit board. So, I think some of my designs are good because I actually pay attention to how big things get and try to keep them from going that way.
Yeah, I don't pay as much attention as I did when I was building consumer products, but because these days I'm mostly working on like high-end radio systems, design computers that go in the radios, because of course anything with the word digital has a computer in it. Somebody's got to design that computer. But I do pay a lot more attention than probably necessary to, like, is this an expensive thing to do? Can I make it cheaper? Just because I started out in consumer electronics. I also had a company a little while, a startup company called Nomadio, and we made an RC controller, and we made the best and lowest latency RC controller in the business, and our first one cost $500, and that's an awful lot for an RC controller. The second one was down to $300, and it actually had two 32-bit processors in it, so that's... Yeah, that was actually a cost reduction too, the two 32-bit processors. So yeah, I pay attention to it. As far as my own projects, I'm working on a couple things, but I mostly had family projects this year, and I had to build my new office down at my beach house, so I didn't spend a lot of time on anything outside. And also, the one problem in this modern era, the last 4 years or so, especially, 2020 to 2022, especially the last 3 years, some parts you designed in your last design can't be had anymore. So I've been redesigning the same thing 4.5 times since I released a product in 2020. So I have been spending an awful lot of time doing my normal work, which makes it less interesting to do other side projects. It's been like 80-hour weeks for 2 years.
In talking to some of the other software engineers who are still writing new Amiga games, they tell me they are really impressed with how easy to understand the architecture working with it, and I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that we had to simplify and keep things clean in order to fit it into the relatively tiny chips and the relatively small number of pins we had to deal with. We had to make architectural compromises because the most pins we could put on a chip was 40 in those days and keep it affordable, and nowadays you can put thousands.
Did you collect the things you worked on? You have a collection from all the things you worked on, the boards, the computers, the things?
I have an A3000, which I'm keeping forever. I have an A1200 that used to belong to my mom, which I'm not sure, it needs to be fixed, and I'll probably not keep it. And I have, strangely enough, I have an A2000 in my garage. I don't know if it works yet or not. It was, I have a friend who does house clean-outs, and occasionally I asked him, I said, well, if you ever find vintage computer gear, bring it to me and I'll find it a good home and maybe get some money for it. And so he brought me an A2000. It's like, oh, okay, it's got my name on the motherboard. I want to open it up and see if it works. Fix it if it doesn't, or at least do something with it. But I don't know if I'm going to keep it. He's going to want money for it. But no, I don't keep too many tokens of that, because you get one thing you don't understand. Like when the A3000 came out brand new, I had already been working on it for 1.5 years. So it wasn't really brand new to me, and I already saw the mistakes, or not mistakes, but the things I would have done better next time, and I didn't really get to do them better next time, but as Commodore started circling the drain. But you're kind of like, I don't think you can't spend too much time with it. Now I did other things, so like I spent time writing code for fun and on Amigas. Sometimes just to teach myself about the system. Sometimes it's like early on, I had a floppy disk that failed, and Disk Doctor threatened to destroy it, and so I wrote a thing called Disk Salve just because I wanted to get my data back, because I was writing this really important program that by the time Diskcell worked, I didn't care about that program anymore. I was more making that program better because it was something that people could use. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, I have two original Amiga 1000s that I still keep to, in case someone wants to see some of the stuff I've worked on.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience?
Wir haben noch ein. Achso.
Ron, you said you're happy that nearly 4 decades passed by since Amiga, and there's still interest here in Europe about Amiga and Amiga systems, in particular for the Amiga 500, 1200, and so on. So I wonder how it is in the States. Is it the same? You're also traveling from convention to convention. Is there a great community, or is it more active here in Europe, especially in Germany?
From my point of view, it's far more active and far larger over here and in the UK. One of the reasons I thought the Amiga was dying was in Silicon Valley there was like only one store that sold them and they went out of business, and Amiga was like not very popular in California, and later I found out that it was very popular in parts of Europe, and it shows with the involvement of the people in the Amiga community up to nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, these days, the only time you hear about Amiga on the East Coast is probably at the Vintage Computer Festival from time to time, and that's not every year. Sometimes, like last year, they did earlier this year, I guess it was, they did a Commodore Day, but that was more a Commodore 64 thing. We did Amiga talks there too, but it was that was unusual for the East Coast. That's usually you don't get much. They did a Commodore history series there some years for a couple of years in a row, and it was Chuck Peddle, then Bill Hurd, then me giving a talk about different eras of Commodore. But it wasn't, it wasn't specific, and I don't know if there's even in the heyday of Commodore, there wasn't that much going on the East Coast. I know West Coast has Amiga shows, but they're not like this. And the thing was, if you knew computers really well, you probably knew about Amiga in the U.S. If you did video, you definitely knew about Amiga in the U.S. And that was about it. It really didn't emerge as a popular platform. I understand while during the Commodore years, they were selling more Amigas in Canada than they were in the whole U.S. Which tells you Canadians have excellent taste in computers, of course.
Yeah, hi, I have a question. What would have been the next Amiga model if Commodore would have survived? Maybe a CD64?
Interesting.
I know a couple things that were in the works. Well, if Commodore had been healthy, you would have gotten a different A4000. It might have had a DSP in it, because the original prototype for that was called the A3000 Plus, and it had a DSP 3210 AT&T coprocessor. The reason you'd want that is it did floating point math 10 times faster than the 040. It also would have had a better 040 circuit. The next generation on the high-end systems was something I was already working on, and that was supposed to work with the AAA chips that we were developing. And that was not going to go in a low-end system, because those AAA chips, you needed either 4 or 6 chips, depending whether you wanted to build a 32-bit or a 64-bit system. You could almost look at that as kind of like, here's the prototype. Now the next generation will make this thing affordable, because it was the biggest chip project Commodore had ever taken on, and each one of those chips was probably bigger than the whole Amiga chipset. On the other hand, the goals for doing games, and also where we were headed on the high end at a different time, was a thing called Ombre, which Dr. Ed Hepler was working on. That was a 2-chip set that gave you, it took away a lot of stuff you have on Amiga. There were no bit planes. What you got were, it was designed mainly around 16-bit pixels with with 4 simultaneous play fields. It had a processor in it that was based on the Hewlett-Packard PA RISC architecture. It had extension instructions in it, so the CPU could do 3D very well, and maybe some other graphic stuff. I never saw the whole instruction set. I just know what I learned from talking to Ed. They were going to be using PCI bus on that. I was going to be using PCI bus on the thing that was going to be called the A4, probably would have been called the A5000. And there probably would, somewhere in there probably would have been an A1200, A500 class machine, which I would think probably may still had a 68000 in it, probably had Ombre chips, so you'd have that rather than the whole operating system running on the PA RISC. It would be as a graphics coprocessor. I know in software we had talked about making about putting PostScript, some kind of PostScript into the operating system, so you could have PostScript windows. There was also talk of having an OpenGL window, some kind of high level that sort of allowed you to put these other layers naturally within the way the Amiga OS worked. I mean, obviously, RTG, retardable graphics, was the thing that was always being talked about, and they had been working on that. And in fact, in Amiga OS 3, they made it about halfway. But models, I mean, there's going to be something like an Amiga 3000, 4000. There would have been something like a 1200. There probably would, assuming the CD32 had done well, there would have been more game machine type Amigas. If the health had continued, there would have been a thing in 1992 called, it didn't have a name on the commercial market because it never became a product, but we were calling it the Amiga 1000 Plus. So it was a low-profile desktop-ish thing that was not much taller than Amiga, than a 1000, but it had 2 slots in it plus a CPU slot. It was supposed to, it had detachable keyboard, supposed to sell for under $1,000 in the U.S. I actually thought that was going to be the one that we hit over the fence, because it was, it was an upgrade it was a real upgrade from the 500/1200. Type of machine, and yet it didn't, it wasn't going to cost anywhere near the cost of it was going to be engineered kind of like those products rather than the higher end products that get expensive for a bunch of weird reasons, including having to have a big power supply and more expensive processors and all that. But it was going to have a 32-bit process of some sort in it. Might have been an ECO20, might have been an ECO30 or something like that. Anyway, those are kind of the things that we were working on. We were also starting to play around with multiprocessing. I did a special board called Gemini that had 2 68030s on it. That was basically just to let the software people start playing around with some kind of multiprocessing within the system.
One question? Yeah. So we all here know that the Amiga is brilliant, no question about it. But if you could turn back time and change one technical decision that you did in the engineering of Amiga, is there any that you would like changed today in hindsight, and which would it be?
Oh, that's a really tough one, because there are lots of choices that we could have made, but like I said, a lot of them by luck turned out to be the right thing. And I'd always worry that if we made another choice, made the blitter different or whatever, it might not have been as cool as it turned out to be. So I'd have to think about that a long time before I answer it. So I don't have a good answer right now.
I would have made changes in management.
That's good, yeah.